The Wyoming wind cut through Sarah Morrison's black wool dress like 1,000 icy needles, but she barely felt it, standing beside the freshly turned earth of her husband's grave. She felt only the burning heat of rage in her chest, a fire that threatened to consume her from within. Thomas Morrison, beloved husband. The wooden cross read. Such simple words for a man who had been her entire world. 3 months had passed since that terrible October morning when their wagon train was attacked. Yet the memory remained as sharp as broken glass. She could still hear the war cries, the thunder of hooves, the screams of the dying. She could still see Tom pushing her beneath the wagon, his blue eyes fierce with determination. "Stay down, Sarah. Whatever happens, stay down." Those were his last words before an arrow found its mark. Sarah's gloved fingers tightened around the wildflowers she'd brought, the last of the season, half frozen and dying like everything else in this God-forsaken land. She knelt, placing them against the cross, her lips moving in a whisper that came out like a hiss. "I curse every last one of those savages. By God and all that's holy, I'll never forgive them. Never." The words tasted like bile, but she meant everyone. They had taken her Tom, her future, her hope for children who would have had his gentle eyes and steady hands. The walk back to her small cabin on the outskirts of Cedar Creek took an hour, but Sarah welcomed the bitter cold. It matched the ice forming around her heart. The townspeople watched her pass, their faces a mixture of pity and calculation. A young widow with property was a rare commodity in Wyoming territory. She'd barely removed her bonnet when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, authoritative and demanding. Sarah knew who it would be before she opened the door. Jacob Thornton filled the doorframe, all 6 feet of him, dressed in an expensive coat that did little to hide the predator beneath. His smile was practiced, showing too many teeth. "Mrs. Morrison." He tipped his hat, though his eyes were already roaming past her into the cabin. "I've come to discuss your situation." "My situation is none of your concern, Mr. Thornton." Sarah kept her voice level, though her hand itched for the rifle Tom had taught her to use. Now. Thornton pushed past her without invitation, tracking mud across her clean floor. A woman alone, especially after such unfortunate circumstances. It's not safe, not proper. "I manage well enough." He turned, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. "Do you? The bank note on this property comes due in 2 months. Your husband's debts will be paid." Sarah lifted her chin, though she knew the impossibility of it. Tom had sunk everything into this year's crop, now dead in the field. With what? Thornton moved closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I'm offering you protection. Sarah, may I call you Sarah? Marriage to me would solve all your problems." "I buried my husband 3 months ago." "Long enough for a practical woman to consider her options." His hand reached for her arm, but Sarah stepped back. "My answer is no." Something ugly flashed across Thornton's face. "You might want to reconsider. Cedar Creek can be unwelcoming to those who don't know their place." After he left, Sarah barred the door and sank into Tom's chair by the cold fireplace. She looked around the cabin, at Tom's books on the shelf, his coat still hanging by the door, the quilts her mother had sent from Boston. Everything here was a reminder of the life she'd lost. But staying meant submitting to Thornton's increasingly aggressive advances. The other women in town had made it clear accept his protection or face the consequences. Wyoming territory had its own harsh laws, and they rarely favored a woman alone. That night, Sarah made her decision. She pulled out Tom's old map, tracing the route to Fort Laramie with one finger. It was a 3-day ride, maybe 4 in winter, dangerous for anyone, near suicide for a woman alone. But Fort Laramie meant work washing, cooking, maybe even teaching if they had need. It meant a chance to start over where Thornton's influence couldn't reach. She packed by candlelight Tom's Navy Colt revolver, his hunting knife, what little food she had left. Dried beans, hardtack, a precious bag of coffee. His warm coat would serve her better than sentiment. The photo of their wedding day she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked close to her heart. At dawn, she saddled Buttercup, Tom's gentle mare. The horse nickered softly, seeming to sense the journey ahead. Sarah took one last look at the cabin, at the dreams that would die here along with the wildflowers on Tom's grave. She was 5 miles out when she heard them. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized Thornton's big bay, flanked by 2 of his men. Going somewhere, Mrs. Morrison. Thornton's voice carried across the snow-covered plain. Sarah didn't answer. Urging Buttercup into a gallop, the mare was steady but no match for Thornton's stallion. Still, Sarah knew this land, had ridden it with Tom countless times. She veered toward the tree line, hoping to lose them in the woods. The first shot went wide, sparking off a rock. The second was closer. Buttercup screamed and stumbled, sending Sarah flying into a snowbank. By the time she struggled to her feet, they were surrounding her. Now that was foolish. Thornton dismounted, his face dark with anger. Making me chase you like a common criminal. Let me go. Sarah's hand found Tom's revolver, but Thornton was faster, knocking it from her grip. You're coming back to Cedar Creek, one way or another. You'll learn to be sensible. Sarah ran. It was hopeless, but she ran anyway, plunging into the forest. Branches tore at her dress. Snow filled her boots. Behind her, Thornton cursed and ordered his men to follow. The ravine appeared suddenly, hidden by snow-covered brush. Sarah tried to stop, but momentum carried her over the edge. She tumbled down, rocks tearing at her clothes and skin, until she landed hard at the bottom. Pain shot through her ankle. When she tried to stand, the world spun. Above, she could hear Thornton shouting, but the voices were growing distant. They must think her dead. Sarah crawled beneath an overhang of rock, pulling Tom's coat tight around her. The temperature was dropping fast. She'd escaped Thornton, but winter was a crueler master. As darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, Sarah wondered if she'd cursed the wrong savages after all. The last thing she remembered was the strange warmth spreading through her limbs, the dangerous comfort that came before freezing. Tom had warned her about it. That's when the cold stops hurting. He'd said, that's when you're in real trouble. As consciousness faded, Sarah thought she heard footsteps crunching through snow, but that was impossible. No one could have followed her here. No one even knew she was alive. The darkness took her then, complete and merciful, and Sarah Morrison surrendered to it, still clutching the oilcloth photo against her heart. Warmth. That was the first thing Sarah felt, an impossible warmth that made no sense. She was supposed to be dead, frozen at the bottom of a ravine. Yet here was heat against her face, the crackling sound of fire, the smell of wood smoke and something else, herbs. Her eyes flew open. Rock walls curved above her, dancing with shadows cast by firelight. A cave. She was in a cave, wrapped in fur blankets that smelled of sage and leather. Panic seized her as memory flooded back. Thornton, the chase, the fall. A figure moved at the edge of her vision. Sarah's hand instinctively reached for Tom's revolver, finding only empty air. The figure stepped into the light, and her breath caught. An Indian, young, perhaps 25 winters, with long dark hair bound back from a face that might have been carved from bronze. He wore deerskin leggings and a wool shirt, white man's clothing mixed with traditional dress. In his hands was a wooden bowl, steam rising from its contents. No! Sarah scrambled backward, pain shooting through her ankle. Stay away from me, you savage, you murderer! The man stopped, his expression unreadable. He set the bowl down on a flat stone within her reach, then retreated to the other side of the fire. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, accented but clear. You were dying I brought you here. I'd rather die than accept help from one of you. The words came out as a snarl. This could be one of them. One of the warriors who had killed Tom. The thought made her sick with rage. The young man said nothing, merely added another piece of wood to the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm howling outside the cave mouth. Sarah's stomach cramped with hunger, and the smell from the bowl, some kind of broth, made her mouth water against her will. I don't want your food. Then you will die. He spoke matter-of-factly, without threat or emotion. The storm will last 3 days, maybe 4. Your ankle is hurt. Without food, without warmth, you will not survive. Why do you care? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I found you at the bottom of the ravine. You spoke a man's name in your sleep. Thomas. Sarah flinched. She had no right to hear Tom's name from this man's lips. You wear mourning clothes. He continued. You have lost someone. Your people killed him. The accusation hung in the air between them like a blade. My people. For the first time, something flickered across his features. I am Shoshone. The attack on your wagon train, that was Cheyenne, maybe Sioux. We are not all the same, any more than all white men are the same. Sarah wanted to argue, to throw his words back at him, but exhaustion pulled at her. The warmth of the cave was making her drowsy, and her ankle throbbed with each heartbeat. Pride warred with survival, and survival won. She reached for the bowl. The broth was rich with meat and wild onions, better than anything she'd eaten in weeks. She drained it, hating herself for the gratitude she felt. The young man refilled it without comment. What's your name? The question escaped before she could stop it. Joseph Crowfeather. She almost laughed at the absurdity. A savage with a Christian name. That's not an Indian name. My father thought it would help us live in both worlds. His voice carried an old sadness. He was wrong. Sarah didn't want to know more, didn't want to see him as anything but an enemy. But the night was long, and the cave felt smaller with silence. Why did you save me? Joseph fed the fire, considering. In my culture, we believe that when the spirits put someone in your path who needs help, you help. To do otherwise brings dishonor. Even a white woman, even an enemy. You are not my enemy, Sarah Morrison. She stiffened. How do you know my name? He gestured to her left hand. Your ring, it has writing inside. I can read. The mission schools. Sarah realized. Many Indians had been forced to attend them, beaten for speaking their own languages, stripped of their culture. She'd heard the stories but never considered what it meant to live between two worlds, accepted by neither. Don't use my name, she said coldly. We're not friends. Joseph nodded, unperturbed. He moved to a pile of supplies near the cave wall, pulling out items she recognized with a start. Tom's saddlebags, his canteen, even the precious photograph still wrapped in oilcloth. Your horse, he explained. I found her not far from where you fell. She did not survive. I brought what I could carry. Tears stung Sarah's eyes. Poor Buttercup, Tom's gentle mare. Another loss, another grief to add to the pile. Thank you, she managed to whisper. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Joseph would leave at dawn to check his trap lines, returning with rabbit or sometimes a grouse. Sarah, unable to walk on her injured ankle, could only tend the fire and fight the walls of her own prejudice. He was patient with her hostility, meeting her barbed comments with quiet dignity. When she refused to speak, he worked in companionable silence, fletching arrows or mending gear. When the pain in her ankle made her gasp, he showed her how to pack it with snow and wrap it tight. On the third day, fevered and delirious from infection setting into a cut on her arm, Sarah found herself rambling about Tom, how they'd met at a church social in Independence, how he'd courted her with wildflowers and poorly written poems, how they'd dreamed of children and a prosperous farm. Joseph listened without judgment, occasionally placing a cool cloth on her burning forehead. When she wept, he turned away to give her privacy. When she cursed his people again, he said nothing. The fever broke on the fourth night. Sarah woke clear-headed to find Joseph keeping vigil, dark circles under his eyes. For the first time, she truly looked at him, not as a savage, but as a man who had spent days caring for someone who hated him. "Why haven't you slept?" "Fever is dangerous. Someone must watch." "I wouldn't have done the same for you." "I know." His simple acceptance shamed her more than any reproach could have. Sarah turned her face to the cave wall, confusion replacing the clean lines of her hatred. When the storm finally cleared, Joseph began preparing for travel. Sarah watched him fashion a travois from pine branches, his movements economical and sure. "You're taking me to Fort Bridger," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, there is a doctor there. Your ankle needs proper care. And then you will go your way, and I will go mine." Sarah felt an unexpected pang at the thought. These days in the cave had been a strange interlude, removed from the real world. Out there, they would be enemies again, the widow and the savage, two people who could never be anything else. "Teach me," she said suddenly. Joseph looked up from his work, surprised. "Teach me how to survive, how to make fire without matches, how to find food, how to read the weather. I won't be helpless again." He studied her for a long moment. "These are not things learned quickly. We have the journey to Fort Bridger. You would learn the ways of savages." There was no mockery in the question, only curiosity. Sarah thought of Thornton, of the townspeople who had watched her with calculating eyes, of the banker who would take her home. She thought of Tom, who would want her to live, to be strong. "I would learn to survive." Joseph nodded slowly. "Then I will teach you." That night, as he showed her how to bank a fire to last through the night, Sarah found herself studying his hands, gentle and competent, so different from the violent images she'd carried in her heart. When he spoke of his father, shot by soldiers for the crime of hunting on his own ancestral lands, she heard grief that matched her own. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Joseph paused in his work. "For what?" "For your father, for—" She couldn't say the rest. "For hating you, for cursing your people, for seeing you as less than human." "We all carry loss," he said simply. "It is what we do with it that matters." As Sarah lay down to sleep, wrapped in furs that no longer smelled foreign, she wondered if her oath of hatred had already begun to crack. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and for the first time since Tom's death, the sound didn't make her afraid. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey to Fort Bridger. Tomorrow, she would have to face the world again. But tonight, in this cave with an unlikely protector, Sarah Morrison allowed herself a moment of peace. The fire crackled softly, and across from her, Joseph Crowfeather kept watch, just as he had every night since pulling her from the snow. Enemy or not, savage or not, he had saved her life. That truth sat uncomfortably in her chest, right next to her heart. The morning sun painted the snow-covered peaks a brilliant gold as Joseph carefully wrapped Sarah's ankle with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. His touch was gentle but sure, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, though whether from pain or something else, she couldn't say. "It will hurt to walk," he warned, helping her to her feet. "Lean on me." Pride made her want to refuse, but practicality won. Her first step sent fire shooting through her leg, and she would have fallen if not for Joseph's steady arm around her waist. "Like this," he murmured, adjusting her weight against him. "Let the strong leg do the work." They made slow progress down the mountain, Joseph pulling the makeshift travois loaded with their supplies. Every few hundred yards, he would stop, checking her ankle, offering water. The sun climbed higher, turning the frozen world into a glittering wonderland that hurt to look at. Snow blindness, Joseph explained, producing a pair of crude goggles made from wood and narrow slits. My mother taught me to make these. As Sarah put them on, grateful for the relief, she found herself asking, "Tell me about her, your mother?" Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried a distant warmth. She was Northern Shoshone, strong. She could track a deer better than any man. And her beadwork. He smiled slightly. She tried to teach me, but my fingers were too clumsy. Is she... Gone. 5 winters now. The sickness that came through the reservation took many. Sarah knew about the reservations, the forced relocations, the broken treaties. She'd never thought about the people who had to live with those broken promises. That first night, she said carefully, you said your father thought a Christian name would help you live in both worlds. Joseph, after the dreamer in your Bible, he thought if I had a white man's name, went to the mission school, learned your ways, we could find peace. His jaw tightened. He died believing it, even after the soldiers shot him for hunting elk on land that had been ours for 1,000 generations. They walked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Sarah found herself really seeing the landscape for the first time, not as a hostile wilderness that had taken her husband, but as Joseph saw it. He pointed out the signs she'd never noticed, the way snow gathered differently on the north side of trees, the tracks of a fox crossing their path, the distant circling of hawks that meant prey below. When they stopped to rest at midday, Joseph built a small fire with remarkable efficiency. Your turn, he said, scattering the kindling. Make it again. Sarah's first attempts were disasters. The bark was too wet, her kindling too thick, her arrangement wrong. Joseph watched without comment, letting her fail and try again. When smoke finally curled up from her small pile, she felt a pride entirely out of proportion to the achievement. Good, Joseph said simply, but his slight smile felt like high praise. As they prepared to move on, Sarah spotted something glinting in a drift, Tom's compass, the one his father had carried in the war. She must have dropped it in her flight from Thornton. Her throat tightened as she turned it over in her hands, the brass worn smooth by generations of Morrison men. He was a good man, Joseph asked quietly. The best, Sarah's voice cracked. He saw the good in everyone. He would have... She stopped, unable to finish. He would have liked you, she'd almost said. That evening, they sheltered in a grove of pines. Joseph showed her how to dig a snow cave, how to line it with pine boughs for insulation. As she worked beside him, Sarah realized her body had stopped tensing every time he moved near her. Tomorrow, we'll set snares, he said, demonstrating the technique with a length of cord. Rabbit runs are easy to spot once you know what to look for. Why are you doing this? Sarah asked suddenly. Teaching me. I mean, you could have just left me at Fort Bridger. Joseph considered the question, feeding small sticks to their fire. My father used to say that hatred was like carrying a hot stone. It only burns the one who holds it. You have been carrying such a stone since your husband died. You don't know anything about it. No, he met her eyes across the fire. I know the look of someone who has sworn vengeance on an entire people. I wore that look myself after my father died, after my promised wife, Mary Singing Bird, died of the measles the agency blankets brought. Sarah's anger deflated. What changed? An old white doctor at the reservation, Dr. Elias Hartwell. He worked himself to exhaustion trying to save our people during the sickness. Caught it himself, nearly died. As I nursed him back to health, I realized hating all whites for the actions of some made no more sense than you hating all Indians for your loss. The fire crackled between them. Sarah pulled Tom's coat tighter, breathing in the familiar scent that was already beginning to fade. I can't just forget, she whispered. I can't just forgive. I'm not asking you to, but perhaps you can learn to see beyond the stone you carry. That night, Sarah dreamed not of the attack but of Tom's laugh, the way he'd spin her around their small kitchen, humming off key. She woke with tears on her cheeks to find Joseph keeping watch, his face etched with its own private sorrows in the firelight. The next day brought new lessons: how to read the sky for weather changes, how to find water beneath ice, how to move silently through the forest. Joseph was a patient teacher, correcting without criticism, praising small victories. When Sarah successfully snared her first rabbit, she felt a fierce joy that surprised her. "I did it." "Yes," Joseph agreed, showing her how to clean it efficiently. "You're learning." As she worked, following his instructions, Sarah found herself stealing glances at him. There was a grace to his movements, an economy born of a lifetime living close to the land. His hands, she noticed, had small scars from years of such work, but they were gentle with the knife, respectful even to this small death that would sustain them. "In my culture," he said, "we thank the spirit of the animal for giving its life. Everything is connected. The rabbit feeds us. We will one day feed the earth. The earth feeds the plants the rabbit eats." "Tom used to say grace before meals," Sarah said softly, thanking God for his bounty. "Perhaps it is not so different." That night, as they shared the rabbit stew, Sarah found it was the best meal she'd eaten in months, not just for the hunger it satisfied, but for the accomplishment it represented. She had done this, set the snare, cleaned the game, helped prepare the meal. For the first time since Tom's death, she felt capable rather than helpless. "You're not what I expected," she admitted as they sat by the fire. Joseph raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" Sarah flushed, ashamed of her previous assumptions. "I don't know. Someone brutal, unfeeling. Not someone who quotes the Bible and speaks of spirits with equal reverence." "We are all more than others expect us to be," Joseph said quietly. "You are not what I expected either." "What do you mean?" "White women I have known at the trading post, at the fort, they scream at the sight of a spider. They faint at the sight of blood. You fall down a ravine, nearly freeze to death, and your first words are to demand I teach you survival. You have iron in you. Sarah Morrison." It was the first time since the cave he'd used her name. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "My mother said I was too stubborn for my own good," she said with a small smile. "Tom used to joke that I could argue with a fence post and win." "Useful quality out here." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear mountain sky. Sarah found herself memorizing this moment: the smell of pine and smoke, the distant howl of coyotes, the solid presence of Joseph beside her. Tomorrow they would reach Fort Bridger. Tomorrow she would return to a world where sitting beside a Shoshone warrior would be scandalous, dangerous, impossible. But tonight, under stars that didn't care about the color of their skin or the history between their peoples, Sarah allowed herself to simply be. When Joseph began to sing softly in his own language, a lullaby, she guessed. From its gentle rhythm, Sarah closed her eyes and listened. She didn't understand the words, but the melody spoke of loss and hope in equal measure. "What does it mean?" she asked when he finished. "It's about the seasons," he translated. "How winter always gives way to spring, no matter how long the cold lasts. My mother sang it when I was young and afraid of the dark." Sarah thought of her own mother, far away in Boston, who would be horrified to know her daughter was alone in the wilderness with an Indian man. She thought of Tom, who had believed in the goodness of people despite all evidence to the contrary. She thought of the oath she'd sworn at his graveside, already crumbling like snow in spring sunshine. "Sing it again," she said softly. Joseph looked at her in surprise, then began the lullaby once more. This time, Sarah let the unfamiliar words wash over her, feeling something tight in her chest begin to loosen. She was still angry, still grieving, still lost. But for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. When she finally slept, her head had somehow found its way to Joseph's shoulder. He didn't move away, just adjusted the blanket over her shoulders and kept his vigil, singing softly of winter becoming spring. The smell hit them first, smoke and something else, something that made Joseph's face go rigid with recognition. Sarah had never smelled death on such a scale, but her body knew it instinctively, recoiling even before her mind understood. "Stay here," Joseph commanded. But Sarah was already following him up the small rise, her injured ankle forgotten in the face of the horror that awaited. The Cheyenne village lay in ruins below them, teepees burned or torn down, belongings scattered across the snow like discarded toys, and the bodies, so many bodies, lying where they'd fallen, their blood turning the white earth crimson. "Oh God," Sarah breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Women clustered near what had been the center of camp, children in their arms, old men sprawled by a ceremonial fire that would never burn again. Warriors who had tried to defend their families lay furthest out, evidence of their desperate last stand. Joseph moved among them like a ghost, his face carved from stone. Sarah followed on unsteady legs, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. These weren't the fierce warriors of her nightmares. These were people, mothers and grandmothers, children who would never grow up, elders who had survived countless winters only to meet this end. "7th Cavalry," Joseph said tonelessly, pointing to spent cartridges, the distinctive marks of shod horses. Maybe yesterday, early morning, they had no warning. Sarah knelt by a young woman, perhaps her own age, who had died trying to shield her infant. The baby's tiny fist still clutched its mother's hair. The sight broke something inside Sarah, and she found herself weeping for these strangers, for Tom, for all the senseless death that stained this land. "They were just defending themselves," she whispered, "just trying to protect their children." Joseph's laugh was bitter. "That's not how the reports will read. They'll say it was a great victory against hostile savages." Sarah thought of the newspaper accounts she'd read, always painting the Indians as bloodthirsty demons, the cavalry as noble heroes. How many of those stories had been lies? How many had been scenes like this, dressed up in patriotic language? A weak cry pierced the silence. Joseph's head snapped up, and he began searching more urgently. Sarah joined him, moving through the carnage with growing desperation. There, a pile of buffalo robes near an overturned travois. Joseph carefully pulled back the robes to reveal an old woman, her arm wrapped protectively around a small child. The woman was gone, but the child, a boy of perhaps 2 years, blinked up at them with dark, frightened eyes. "Hush, little one," Joseph murmured in Cheyenne, gently extracting the child from his grandmother's embrace. The boy whimpered but didn't cry out, as if he'd already learned that silence meant survival. Sarah reached out instinctively, and Joseph placed the child in her arms. The boy was cold, hungry, traumatized, but alive. He weighed almost nothing, his small body trembling against her chest. "We can't leave him," Sarah said fiercely. "The soldiers might come back, or wolves. We need to go." They worked quickly, Joseph gathering what supplies he could from the devastation blankets, a small amount of pemmican, a cradle board. Sarah held the child, rocking him gently, whispering soothing nonsense as Tom had once imagined doing with their own children. As they prepared to leave, Joseph built a small cairn of stones. "I'll send word to the Cheyenne when we reach the fort," he said. "They'll want to come for their dead." Sarah looked back at the destroyed village, thinking of her own bitter oath at Tom's graveside. These people had been someone's beloved, someone's entire world, children who would grow up without parents, parents who had died trying to protect their young. "What's his name?" she asked, adjusting the child in the cradle board Joseph had showed her how to wear. "I don't know, but—" Joseph touched the boy's cheek gently. "Samuel. It means heard by God. Perhaps God heard his cry when no one else could." They traveled in heavy silence, the weight of what they'd witnessed pressing down on them. The child? Samuel stayed quiet, his dark eyes tracking everything with unnatural awareness for one so young. When they stopped to rest, Sarah fed him small pieces of pemmican softened with water, and he ate with the desperate hunger of a child who didn't know when food might come again. "He's not an Indian child," Sarah said suddenly, fiercely. "He's just a child." Joseph looked at her strangely. 3 days ago, you would have called him a savage." 3 days ago, I was a fool. The admission came hard, but it was true. I blamed an entire race for my loss, just as Thornton blamed me for refusing him. Just as those soldiers blamed babies for being born Cheyenne. That night, they made camp in a sheltered valley. Samuel had finally fallen into exhausted sleep against Sarah's chest, and she found herself unwilling to put him down. The trust in that small weight against her heart was both healing and heartbreaking. "Your husband," Joseph said quietly. "He would have been a good father." "Yes." Sarah stroked Samuel's dark hair, so different from the fair-haired children she'd imagined. "He wanted a large family, said he'd teach our sons to farm and our daughters to shoot." She smiled sadly. "I told him he had that backwards." "My Mary wanted children too," Joseph said, his voice soft with memory. "She had names picked out, songs to sing them." He looked at the sleeping child. "Life rarely gives us what we plan for." "No," Sarah agreed, "but sometimes it gives us what we need." They were perhaps a day from Fort Bridger when Joseph grew tense, his hand moving to his rifle. Sarah had learned to read his moods, to trust his instincts. She held Samuel closer, her free hand finding Tom's revolver. "Riders," Joseph said quietly. 4, maybe 5, moving fast. Sarah's blood went cold. Thornton, somehow. He'd tracked them, or soldiers, looking for survivors from the massacre. Either way meant danger. "Take the child and hide," Joseph ordered, but Sarah shook her head. "We face this together." The riders crested the ridge, not Thornton, but cavalry soldiers, their uniforms still showing traces of blood. Their leader, a young lieutenant with cold gray eyes, spotted Joseph and immediately drew his weapon. "Step away from the woman. Indian." "He's with me," Sarah said clearly, moving to stand beside Joseph. "He saved my life." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed, taking in her torn dress, the Indian child on her back, her defensive posture beside a Shoshone warrior. "Ma'am, you're clearly not in your right mind. What's your name?" "Sarah Morrison, and I'm perfectly sound. This man rescued me from certain death and has been escorting me to Fort Bridger." "And the child?" Sarah's chin lifted. "My child." The lie came without thought, but she felt Joseph's slight start of surprise beside her. The soldiers exchanged glances. A white woman claiming an Indian baby, defending a warrior. It didn't fit their neat categories. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said slowly, as if talking to someone simple. "That's an Indian child. Whatever this savage told you—" "The only savages I've seen," Sarah interrupted, her voice like ice, "wore blue uniforms and murdered babies in their mothers' arms. We passed through your handiwork yesterday. Very brave of you all, slaughtering sleeping families." The lieutenant's face flushed dark. "Those were hostiles. Orders are to what? Kill children, because that's what you did." Sarah pulled Samuel around to her front, showing his small, frightened face. "Look at him. Look at this dangerous hostile and tell me how murdering his family made anyone safer." "Careful, ma'am. That sounds like treason talk." Joseph stepped forward slightly, and immediately 3 rifles swung toward him. Sarah moved too, keeping her body between the guns and Samuel. "The lady is distressed," Joseph said calmly. "She has been through much. We mean only to reach Fort Bridger peacefully." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Sarah could feel Samuel trembling against her chest, could see the soldiers' fingers tight on their triggers. One wrong move and they'd all be dead. Finally, The lieutenant holstered his pistol. "Fort Bridger is that way," he said coldly. "I suggest you make haste. And ma'am, you might want to reconsider the company you keep. And that child, it would be better for everyone if it was taken to the agency." "Over my dead body," Sarah said quietly. The lieutenant touched his hat mockingly. "That can be arranged." After the soldiers rode off, Sarah found herself shaking. Joseph's hand touched her shoulder gently. "That was dangerous. They were going to kill you. Take Samuel." She turned to face him, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. "I couldn't let that happen." "Sarah," he began, then stopped. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with unspoken words. Samuel made a small sound, breaking the moment, and Joseph stepped back. "We should go. They might change their minds." That night, their last before Fort Bridger, Joseph taught her a Shoshone lullaby for Samuel. As she sang it, fumbling over the unfamiliar words, she felt Tom's presence, not as a weight of grief, but as a gentle blessing. He would have understood this. She thought he would have seen the man, not the Indian. He would have loved this child who needed love. "Tomorrow, you'll be safe," Joseph said. "The fort has good people. They'll help you get to California or wherever you choose to go. And you, I'll go back to my people. Winter is hard. They need every hunter." Sarah wanted to ask him to come with her, but the words stuck in her throat. What life could they have? A white woman, a Shoshone man, and a Cheyenne child. The world would never let them be. Instead, she memorized his face in the firelight, the way his hands moved when he talked, the rare smile that transformed his features. When he reached over to adjust Samuel's blanket, his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them pulled away. "Joseph," she said softly. "Yes." "Thank you for saving my life, for teaching me, for—" She gestured helplessly at everything that had passed between them. Too large for words. He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, in my culture, we believe some spirits are meant to meet, even if only briefly, like the hawk and the mouse, natural enemies who sometimes share the same thermal, rising together before parting ways." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm glad we shared this thermal." "As am I, Sarah Morrison." When she woke the next morning, Joseph was already packing, his movements efficient and somehow final. Fort Bridger waited like a threshold once crossed. Their strange journey together would end. Sarah held Samuel close, humming the Shoshone lullaby, trying not to think about how empty the world would feel without Joseph Crowfeather in it. The rising sun painted the mountains gold and rose, beautiful and indifferent to human hearts. "Ready?" Joseph asked. "No," Sarah answered honestly. "But let's go anyway." They walked toward Fort Bridger together. The widow, the warrior, and the orphaned child. While behind them their footprints in the snow slowly filled, leaving no trace of their passing. Fort Bridger rose from the plains like a promise of civilization, its wooden walls and fluttering flag a stark contrast to the wild country they'd traversed. Sarah felt Joseph tense beside her as they approached the gates, his hand moving instinctively to his knife before dropping away. "Papers." The guard at the gate looked them over with undisguised suspicion. A bedraggled white woman, an Indian man, and a native child made for an unusual party. "Mrs. Sarah Morrison," she said firmly. "Widow of Thomas Morrison, late of Cedar Creek. This man saved my life." The guard's eyes lingered on Joseph with clear distaste. "Indians aren't welcome after dark. He'll need to move on." "He's with me," Sarah insisted, but Joseph touched her arm gently. "It's all right. You're safe now." But she wasn't safe. Not really. The moment they entered the fort, Sarah felt the weight of civilization's judgment. Women pulled their children closer as they passed. Men's hands drifted to their weapons. And everyone stared at Samuel. secure in his cradleboard against her back. At the administration building, they were met by Captain Marcus Crenshaw, a man whose eyes held the same cold hatred she'd seen in the lieutenant's. His face was weathered by years of frontier service, marked by a distinctive scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, not offering her a seat. "I've heard about your situation. Most unfortunate about your husband." "Thank you," Sarah managed. However, his eyes moved to Samuel. "We cannot allow you to keep that child. There's an agency for such cases. They'll see it's properly raised." "No." The word came out harder than she'd intended. "Samuel stays with me." "Samuel?" Crenshaw's eyebrows rose. "You've named it Mrs. Morrison. Surely you understand the impropriety. A white woman raising a savage—" "The only savages I've encountered," Sarah interrupted, "wore uniforms and murdered children. This baby stays with me." Crenshaw's face darkened. "I could have you arrested for sedition." "Try it." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Arrest the widow of a man killed by Indians for saving an Indian baby. See how that plays in the Eastern newspapers." They stared at each other, wills clashing like sabers. "Finally!" Crenshaw waved his hand dismissively. "On your head be it, but don't expect help from this fort when that thing grows up and turns on you." Outside, Sarah found Joseph waiting by the trading post. He'd already procured supplies for his journey back: ammunition, salt, a new blanket. Seeing him prepared to leave made her chest tight. "You heard?" she asked. "Walls are thin." He looked at Samuel, then back at her. "You're brave to keep him. It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is." They stood awkwardly. Too much to say and no words adequate. Around them, the fort bustled with activity, but Sarah felt as if they stood in a bubble of stillness. "There's something else," she said suddenly, pulling out a carefully wrapped bundle. Tom's compass. His father carried it through the Mexican War, and his grandfather before that. She pressed it into Joseph's hands. "I want you to have it." Joseph stared at the brass instrument, understanding the weight of the gift. "I cannot—" "Please, so you'll always find your way home." His fingers closed around it, and for a moment, their hands clasped together over the compass. "Sarah, Mrs. Morrison," a woman's voice called out. Breaking the moment, Sarah turned to see a middle-aged couple approaching, their faces kind but concerned. The woman wore a simple gray dress and bonnet, marking her as a missionary's wife. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Wheeler," the woman said, eyeing Joseph warily but keeping her tone polite. "My husband Richard and I run the mission school. We heard about your circumstances." Reverend Wheeler, a tall man with gentle eyes, stepped forward. "We'd like to offer you shelter, ma'am, and perhaps we can help with arrangements for the child." "Samuel stays with me," Sarah said firmly. The Wheelers exchanged glances. "Of course," Mrs. Wheeler said carefully. "But surely you'll want to find him a proper situation eventually. There are good Christian families who might—" "No, ma'am," Reverend Wheeler said gently. "Think of the child's future. Growing up between two worlds, belonging to neither. It's a hard path." Joseph spoke quietly. "All paths are hard, but a child raised with love has a better chance than one raised with shame." The Reverend studied Joseph with new interest. "You speak like an educated man." "Mission school. 4 years." Joseph's tone was neutral, but Sarah caught the undercurrent of pain. She'd heard stories of those schools' children beaten for speaking their own language, forced to cut their hair, forbidden their culture. "Then you understand," Wheeler said, "the importance of civilization." "I understand many things," Joseph replied, "including the cost of losing one's soul to gain acceptance." An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Mrs. Wheeler cleared her throat. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, our offer stands. We have a small room behind the church. It's not much, but it's clean and safe. Sarah glanced at Joseph, who nodded slightly. Thank you, I accept. As the Wheelers led her away, Sarah looked back. Joseph stood where she'd left him, the compass in his hand catching the afternoon light. Their eyes met across the growing distance, and he raised his hand slightly in farewell or blessing. She couldn't tell. The room behind the church was indeed small but clean, with a narrow bed and a cradle that made Sarah's throat tight as she settled Samuel into it. Mrs. Wheeler lingered in the doorway. That Indian, she said carefully. Did he harm you in any way? Joseph Crowfeather saved my life, Sarah said firmly. He showed me more kindness and honor than most white men I've known. Mrs. Wheeler's face showed her struggle between Christian charity and frontier prejudice. Well, I suppose the Lord works in mysterious ways. That night, as Sarah lay listening to Samuel's breathing, she thought about paths and choices. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the fort soldiers laughing, horses nickering, the everyday noise of a world that would never fully accept her choices. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap, but it was only Mrs. Wheeler with a bundle of letters. These came for you, forwarded from Cedar Creek. Sarah recognized her aunt's handwriting immediately. Martha Whitfield, her mother's sister, had moved to San Francisco years ago. Her letters had always been full of descriptions of the growing city, the opportunities there. By candlelight, Sarah read her aunt's latest message, written 2 months ago. My dear niece, I was heartbroken to hear of Thomas's passing. Please know you always have a home here. San Francisco is full of possibilities for a woman of courage. The school where I teach needs instructors, and my house is large enough for family. A chance at a new life, a place where no one knew her story, where Samuel might have a chance at acceptance in a city full of strangers from everywhere. But it meant truly leaving everything behind, including any hope of seeing Joseph again. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Captain Crenshaw arrived with 2 other officers, their purpose clear before they spoke. Mrs. Morrison, I'm afraid there's been a development. That Indian who brought you here, he's wanted for questioning about raids on supply wagons. That's ridiculous, Sarah protested. Joseph is Shoshone. He told me the raids were... All Indians are suspects. Crenshaw cut her off. Where is he? Gone. He left yesterday. Convenient. Crenshaw's scarred face twisted with suspicion. You wouldn't be protecting him, would you? From false accusations, I would if I could. Careful, Mrs. Morrison. Your sympathies are already suspect, and harboring a fugitive. Is that a threat, Captain? A warning. This territory has no room for Indian lovers or their offspring. His eyes moved meaningfully to Samuel's cradle. After they left, Mrs. Wheeler appeared, wringing her hands. My dear, perhaps it would be best if you moved on quickly. The captain, he lost his own family to an Indian raid years ago. He's not rational on the subject. Sarah understood the subtext. She wasn't safe here, not with Crenshaw's hatred focused on her. That afternoon, she made her decision. I need to join a wagon train to California, she told Reverend Wheeler. As soon as possible. There's one leaving in 3 days, he said, relief clear in his voice. The Hatfield party. Good people. Mostly. I can arrange it. 3 days. Sarah spent them preparing, buying supplies with the little money from Tom's hidden cash box, learning to manage Samuel along with her tasks. The child was remarkably quiet, as if he understood the need for discretion. She sang him Joseph's lullabies at night and told him stories of his bravery during the day. On her last evening at the fort, Sarah climbed to the wall walkway. Samuel bound snugly against her chest. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting them in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere out there, Joseph was making his way back to his people, carrying Tom's compass. Look, Samuel, she whispered. Remember this? Remember the mountains and the sky? You come from this land, no matter where we go. A movement in the trees caught her eye. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure on a paint horse, watching from the forest edge. Her heart leapt, but when she blinked, there was only shadow. Still, she raised her hand in greeting to the empty woods, just in case. The wind carried the scent of sage and pine, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, lonely but not alone, calling to its pack across the miles. Tomorrow, she would begin the long journey to California. Tomorrow, she would face whatever judgment awaited a white woman who chose to raise an Indian child. But tonight, she stood between worlds, the fort at her back, the wilderness before her, and in her arms, a child who embodied hope for a different future. Thank you, she whispered to the wind, to the mountains, to whatever spirit had brought Joseph Crowfeather into her life when she needed him most. Then she went inside to pack their few belongings and prepare for the journey ahead. In her pocket, her aunt's letter promised sanctuary. In her arms, Samuel slept peacefully, and in her heart, against all sense and propriety, lived a love she could never speak but would always carry, like a compass pointing true north, no matter how far she traveled from these mountains and the man who had taught her to survive them. The Hatfield wagon train stretched out across the prairie like a great serpent, 15 wagons strong and full of families seeking new lives in California. Sarah had been assigned to share supplies with the Brennan family, Irish immigrants with 3 children who looked at Samuel with curious rather than hostile eyes. He's a quiet one, Mrs. Kate Brennan observed on their 3rd day out, watching Samuel play with her youngest. Good temperament for the trail. Sarah appreciated the woman's tact in not asking questions. Others in the train weren't so kind. She'd already overheard whispers, Indian lover. Shameless, asking for trouble. They were a week into the journey when the trouble found them. Sarah had taken Samuel down to the creek to wash clothes while the men hunted. The December air was crisp but clear, and Samuel laughed as he splashed his hands in the cold water. It was a moment of simple peace that shattered with the sound of horses. Thornton sat atop his bay stallion, flanked by 3 hired guns. His clothes were trail-worn, but his eyes held the same possessive hunger she remembered. "Hello, Sarah. You've led me quite a chase." Sarah's hand found the knife at her belt, one of many skills Joseph had taught her. "How did you find me?" "Fort Bridger keeps records. Amazing what information a little gold can buy." He dismounted slowly, his men spreading out to flank her. "You belong in Cedar Creek, as my wife." "I belong to no one." Thornton's eyes moved to Samuel, his lip curling. "And you've added to your sins, raising a savage brat. Have you no shame?" "The only shame here is yours." Sarah shifted Samuel behind her, calculating distances. The camp was too far. No one would hear her scream. "Drop the child and come quietly. This doesn't have to be unpleasant." "You mean like when you chased me into a ravine when you left me to die?" "You always were too dramatic." Thornton stepped closer. "Last chance. Sarah, leave the brat and come home where you belong." Sarah's answer was to pull her knife. Thornton laughed, but it died when she took a combat stance Joseph had shown her. Weight balanced, blade angled properly. "That savage taught you some tricks. Did he teach you other things too? Is that why you carry his whelp?" The insult to Joseph burned, but Sarah kept her voice level. "Walk away, Thornton. You don't want this fight." 4 against 1, I like my odds." The first man rushed her, expecting an easy victory. Sarah sidestepped, slashing across his arm exactly as Joseph had taught. The man screamed, dropping his gun. The second came more carefully, but Sarah was already moving, using his momentum against him. But there were too many. The third man grabbed Samuel while she was engaged, and Sarah's moment of distraction cost her. Thornton's fist connected with her jaw, sending her sprawling. "Enough games," he snarled, standing over her. "You're coming back if I have to drag you." The arrow that sprouted from his shoulder seemed to surprise him. He stared at it stupidly before the pain hit, sending him to his knees with a scream. Joseph materialized from the trees like an avenging spirit, already knocking another arrow. His paint horse charged through Thornton's men, scattering them. In seconds, the clearing became a battlefield. Sarah scrambled for Samuel, clutching him close as Joseph fought with deadly efficiency. When the dust settled, Thornton's men had fled, and Thornton himself lay groaning on the ground, the arrow still protruding from his shoulder. "You?" Thornton gasped, staring up at Joseph with hate-filled eyes. "I should have known. Savages always stick together." Joseph looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled out Tom's compass, checking it with exaggerated care. "Strange. It keeps pointing me back here." "Despite everything," Sarah felt her lips twitch toward a smile. "Joseph." He knelt beside Thornton, studying the wound. "Not fatal, if properly treated." He looked at Sarah. "Your choice. I can end this threat forever. Or—" Sarah stared down at Thornton, this man who had hunted her, threatened her, tried to own her. It would be so easy to nod, to let Joseph's next arrow fly true. The old Sarah, the one who had sworn vengeance at Tom's grave, would have done it without hesitation. But she looked at Samuel in her arms, thought of the cycles of violence that had orphaned him, thought of Joseph's words about carrying hot stones. "Let him live," she said quietly. "But not out of mercy, because someone has to break the cycle, because I won't teach Samuel that killing solves problems." She knelt beside Thornton. "You're going to live. You're going to crawl back to Cedar Creek. And if you ever come after me again, I won't be so generous. Joseph will find you, no matter where you hide, and next time, I won't stop him." Thornton's eyes darted between them, and, for the first time, Sarah saw fear there. "Good." Joseph efficiently bound the wound, then helped Thornton onto his horse. As the beaten man rode away, slumped and defeated, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "You followed me," she said to Joseph. The compass pointed west. His slight smile faded as he looked toward the wagon train's dust in the distance. "They'll come looking for you soon." "Come with us." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Please, I know it's dangerous. I know what people will say, but—" "Sarah." He said her name gently, like a prayer. "You know I cannot. Your people will never accept—" "They're not my people." She stepped closer, Samuel between them. "My people are those who show kindness, who protect the innocent, who choose love over hate. You're my people, Joseph." Something shifted in his face, a wall crumbling. "The things I feel, they are not wise." When has wisdom ever had anything to do with the heart? He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing Samuel's cheek, then Sarah's. "To care for you, to want, it goes against everything. Your husband, Tom, would understand." Sarah said firmly, "He'd want me to live, to love, to be happy. He'd see the man you are, not the color of your skin." "And you," Joseph's voice was rough. "What do you see?" Sarah set Samuel down gently, then stepped into Joseph's space, her hands framing his face. "I see the man who saved me in more ways than one, who taught me to survive, who showed me that hatred is a choice, and I can choose differently." "Sarah?" She kissed him. It was nothing like the gentle pecks she'd shared with Tom. This was fire and necessity. Months of denied feeling poured into a single moment. Joseph went rigid. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him like a drowning man finding shore. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel had toddled over to tug at Joseph's leggings, babbling happily. "Even he knows. Sarah said softly. Joseph looked down at the child, then at her. War clear in his eyes. The wagon master will never allow. Then we'll make our own way. Buy supplies at the next trading post. Head to California on our own terms. You would risk that travel the winter mountains with a skilled guide who knows the land. Yes. Sarah gripped his hands. I'm not afraid of hard journeys anymore. You taught me that. Voices called from the direction of the wagon train. The hunting party returning. Joseph tensed to flee, but Sarah held him fast. Choose, she said. Choose to try. Choose hope over fear. Choose us. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, then at Samuel, then at the compass in his hand. Finally, something eased in his shoulders. The Hatfield train, he said slowly. I could offer my services as a guide. Many trains hire scouts. Yes, hope bloomed in Sarah's chest. They may refuse. They may make our lives difficult. Let them try. Sarah's chin lifted. I've faced down soldiers and survivors. I've learned to trap rabbits and build fires. I've chosen to raise a Cheyenne child as my own. I'm not afraid of narrow-minded wagon masters. Joseph's rare, full smile transformed his face. No, you are not afraid of much anymore. Sarah Morrison. Sarah Crow Feather has a nice sound, she said boldly, then blushed at her own forwardness. You move fast for a Boston woman. Joseph teased, but his eyes were warm. Perhaps we should start with traveling companions. Partners, Sarah corrected. Full partners. The hunting party crested the rise, stopping short at the sight of Sarah standing close to a Shoshone warrior, Samuel playing at their feet. She saw their hands move to weapons, saw the suspicion bloom on their faces. Sarah stepped forward, head high. This is Joseph Crowfeather. He just saved my life from bandits who've been following the train. I propose we hire him as a guide. The wagon master, Ezekiel Hatfield, was a pragmatic man. He looked at the blood on the ground, at Sarah's torn dress and bruised face, at Joseph's capable stance. You vouch for him, with my life and my child's life. Hatfield studied them all for a long moment. Can he get us through the Rockies before the worst snows? Joseph nodded. I know routes the wagon trains don't use, harder but passable. We would need to move fast. And your fee? Passage to California. Protection for... He glanced at Sarah. My family. The words sent warmth through Sarah's chest. Hatfield's eyes sharpened, understanding passing across his weathered features. That's going to cause problems with some folks. Then they can find another train, Sarah said firmly, or walk to California alone. A bark of surprised laughter escaped Hatfield. You've got spine, Mrs. Morrison. All right, we'll try it. But first sign of trouble. There won't be, Joseph said quietly. You have my word. As the group headed back to the wagons, Sarah walked beside Joseph, Samuel in her arms. The future stretched uncertain before them, full of challenges, prejudice, and danger, but also full of possibility. No regrets, Joseph asked quietly. Sarah thought of Tom, of the love they'd shared and the future they'd lost. She thought of her oath of vengeance, now transformed into something larger, a commitment to break cycles, to choose love over hate, to build the world Samuel deserved to grow up in. No regrets, she said firmly. Only hope. As they approached the wagon train, Sarah saw the stairs, heard the whispers already starting. Let them talk. She had survived worse than gossip, and now she had a partner who understood survival, a child who embodied hope, and a journey toward a new life. The Rocky Mountains loomed ahead, magnificent and daunting. But Sarah Morrison, soon to be Sarah Crowfeather, was no longer afraid of difficult paths. Joseph had taught her that. Sometimes the hardest trails led to the most beautiful destinations. The moment Joseph entered the wagon circle, Sarah felt the atmosphere shift like a storm front moving in. Conversations died mid-sentence. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men's hands drifted to their weapons with practiced ease. "That's him," Sarah announced clearly, her voice carrying across the gathered families. "Joseph Crow Feather, the man who saved my life and will guide us safely through the mountains. You brought a savage into our camp." The voice belonged to Hiram Patterson, a Missouri farmer whose distrust of Indians was well known. "Have you lost your mind, woman?" "The only thing I've lost," Sarah replied evenly, "is my patience for ignorance. This man has proven his worth 10 times over." Joseph stood quietly beside her, his posture relaxed but alert. Sarah had learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked every potential threat while appearing calm. "Mrs. Morrison speaks truth." Ezekiel Hatfield intervened, his authority as wagon master carrying weight. "We need a guide who knows these mountains. Winter's coming fast, and the usual routes will be impassable soon. I'd rather take my chances with the snow than trust an Indian." Patterson spat. "Then you're welcome to leave the train," Sarah said coolly. "I'm sure your wife and children will appreciate freezing to death for the sake of your prejudice." Mrs. Patterson, a worn woman with 5 children clinging to her skirts, shot her husband a warning look. "Hiram, perhaps we should listen." "Quiet, woman." "No." Sarah stepped forward, Samuel secure in her arms. "Let her speak. Let all the women speak. We're the ones who'll be nursing frostbitten children and burying babies in frozen ground if we don't reach California before the worst storms." Kate Brennan was the first to stand. "I trust Mrs. Morrison's judgment. If she says this man saved her life, I believe her." One by one, other women began to speak up. They'd seen Sarah's injuries, heard her account of Thornton's attack. More importantly, they'd watched her on the trail, working hard, sharing what she had, caring for Samuel without complaint. She'd earned their respect, even if they didn't understand her choices. "My Martha's been sick," admitted Mrs. Elmira Hobson, an elderly woman traveling with her granddaughter. "If this guide knows ways to get us through faster, safer, I say we take the chance." Joseph finally spoke, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I know where to find shelter when storms come. I know which passes stay clear longest, where game travels in winter, how to read weather signs your almanacs don't show. I can help your sick with medicines your doctors don't know." He looked directly at Patterson. "Or you can trust your pride and watch your family suffer. Your choice." "Medicines, Mrs." Hobson leaned forward eagerly. "You know healing." "My mother was a healer. She taught me plants that break fever, ease breathing, stop infection." "Witchcraft," Patterson sneered, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Medicine," Joseph corrected calmly. "The same willow bark tea your grandmothers used for pain, just prepared differently. The same moldy bread poultices for wounds, but with plants that work better." Young doctor, Marcus Pemberton, traveling west to start a practice, stepped forward. "I'd be interested in learning about these remedies. Medical knowledge shouldn't be dismissed based on its source." The tide was turning. Sarah felt it in the way the crowd's hostility began to fragment. Not everyone would accept Joseph, but enough would tolerate him for practical reasons. "We vote," Hatfield declared. "All in favor of hiring Joseph Crow Feather as guide." Hands rose slowly. The Brennans, the Hobsons, Dr. Pemberton, several families with children. Not a majority, but enough. Those against. Patterson's faction raised their hands, faces set in stubborn lines. "The ayes have it," Hatfield announced. "Mr. Crowfeather, you're hired. Standard guide wages, plus food for your family." He stumbled slightly over the last word, but pushed through. As the crowd dispersed, several people approached. Dr. Pemberton wanted to discuss medical knowledge. Kate Brennan quietly offered to share their evening meal. Even some who'd voted against seemed less hostile, more watchful. But Patterson wasn't finished. He cornered Sarah near the supply wagon, his face ugly with rage. "You're making a mistake, bringing him here, flaunting your unnatural relationship." "There's nothing unnatural about kindness," Sarah interrupted. "Or gratitude, or respect." "Respect for a murdering savage." "The only murderer I see," Sarah said quietly, "is the hatred in your heart. It'll kill you surer than any Indian would." That night, Joseph made camp just outside the wagon circle, close enough for protection, far enough to avoid provocation. Sarah brought him dinner, Samuel toddling alongside. "You didn't have to defend me so fiercely," Joseph said as she settled beside him. "Yes, I did." Sarah watched Samuel explore pine cones by the firelight. "They need to know where I stand, where we stand." "We," Joseph's voice was carefully neutral. Sarah took a breath. "I meant what I said earlier, about partners, about everything. Sarah." He turned to face her fully. "You need to understand what you're choosing. It won't get easier. There will always be Pattersons. Always be those who see our connection as betrayal of your race. Then they don't understand what America is supposed to be." Sarah said fiercely. "Tom used to read me the Declaration. All men are created equal." He believed it, really believed it. Tom sounds like he was a rare man. He was, and he'd be happy I found another good man. Sarah reached for Joseph's hand, lacing their fingers together. "Don't you see? This isn't betraying his memory. It's honoring it. He taught me to see people's hearts, not their skin. You're just the advanced course." That surprised a laugh from Joseph. "Advanced course. Very advanced." Sarah agreed, her thumb tracing circles on his palm. "But I always was a good student." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching Samuel stack pine cones with intense concentration. The wagon camp sounds drifted over fiddle music, children laughing, the everyday noise of people living. "When we reach California," Joseph said slowly, "what then your aunt may not welcome? Then we'll make our own way. San Francisco is full of strangers from everywhere. We won't be the oddest family there." "Family." Joseph tested the word like he was tasting something new. "If you'll have us," Sarah said softly. "Officially, I mean, there are judges in California who perform all kinds of marriages. Some might even marry us." Joseph's hand tightened on hers. "You would take my name, bear children who would be loved," Sarah finished firmly. "Who would know both their heritages, who would grow up with Samuel as their brother, in a house full of languages and stories and possibilities." "The women in your Boston would faint. Good thing I'm not in Boston." Joseph pulled her against his side, his arm solid and warm around her shoulders. "You know I love you." It wasn't a question. "I know," Sarah said simply, "just as you know I love you." "Even though I'm—" She stopped his words with a kiss, brief but firm. "You're Joseph. That's all that matters." Samuel chose that moment to tumble into their laps, babbling excitedly about his pine cone tower. Joseph lifted him easily, settling the boy on his knee. "What do you think, little warrior?" he asked in Shoshone. "Shall we be a family?" Samuel's response was to pat Joseph's face with sticky hands and giggle. Sarah laughed, and Joseph smiled, the full, transformative smile she was privileged to see more often now. "I think that's a yes," she said. The next morning brought fresh challenges. 2 families announced they were leaving the train rather than follow an Indian guide. Hatfield let them go without argument. "Dead weight," he called them privately. But others surprised Sarah. Mrs. Hobson approached Joseph directly, her granddaughter Martha in tow. The girl was pale, her breathing labored. "She's been like this for weeks," the old woman said. "Gets worse at night. Our doctor in Missouri said it was weak lungs. might not survive the journey. Joseph knelt beside the child, listening to her breathing with focused attention. Not weak lungs. The air bothers her. Dust, smoke from campfires. I can make tea that helps. Show you how to help her breathe easier at night. Would you? Hope flickered in Mrs. Hobson's eyes. I'd be grateful. We both would. As Joseph prepared the medicine, explaining each plant to the fascinated doctor. Pemberton. Sarah saw the walls beginning to crack. Fear was powerful, but a sick child was more powerful still. Over the following days, Joseph proved his worth repeatedly. He found a sheltered valley just before a brutal storm hit. He located fresh game when supplies ran low. He treated injuries and illnesses with quiet competence. Slowly, grudgingly, even some holdouts began to thaw. Not Patterson. His hatred ran too deep. But others started nodding when Joseph passed, accepting his presence if not embracing it. You're winning them over. Sarah told him one evening as they watched Samuel play with the Brennan children. Some of them. Joseph agreed. It helps that you stand with me so publicly. Where else would I stand? He caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. Have I told you today that you're remarkable? Not since this morning, Sarah teased, then grew serious. Joseph, when we were in the cave, you talked about spirits meant to meet. Do you still believe that? More each day, he said softly. You came into my life full of hatred and pain. I thought I was just saving a woman from freezing. Instead, I found... What? Sarah prompted when he paused. Purpose, he finished. For so long, I've lived between worlds, belonging to neither. With you, with Samuel, I belong. Sarah blinked back tears. We belong together, all three of us, and whoever else comes along. Already planning more children. Well, Sarah said with mock seriousness, Samuel needs brothers and sisters. It's only practical. Joseph's laugh rang out across the camp, rich and free. Several people looked over in surprise. The stoic Indian guide showing joy was still a novelty. Patterson chose that moment to stomp past, muttering about shameless displays and corrupting the children. Sarah felt Joseph tense, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. Let him go. He's already lost. He just doesn't know it yet. How do you figure? Because love is stronger than hate. It always has been. It just sometimes takes longer to win. As if to prove her point, young Martha Hobson ran over, breathing easily for the first time in months. Mr. Joseph, look what grandmother taught me. She demonstrated a simple beating pattern, clearly proud. Very good. Joseph praised, his voice gentle. Next, I'll show you how to add color patterns. Really? The girl bounced excitedly, then paused. Grandmother says you're teaching me Indian ways. Is that bad? Joseph glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragement. What do you think? He asked the child. Martha considered seriously. I think pretty is pretty, no matter who makes it, and breathing better is good no matter what color the person is who helps. Wise words, Sarah said, ruffling the girl's hair. Maybe you should explain that to Mr. Patterson. He wouldn't listen, Martha said matter-of-factly. Grandmother says his ears are closed by meanness. Even Joseph couldn't hide his smile at that. As Martha scampered back to her grandmother, Sarah leaned against his shoulder. See, she said, the children understand. They'll grow up in a different world because we're showing them it's possible. Assuming we survive Patterson's plotting, Joseph said wryly. We'll survive, Sarah said with certainty. We've survived worse, and we're together now. That makes us stronger than any hatred he can muster. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah felt a deep contentment settle in her bones. The journey ahead was still fraught with danger, both from nature and from human prejudice. But she was no longer facing it alone. She had Joseph, steady and strong beside her. She had Samuel, giggling as he played with other children who were learning not to see his brown skin as different. She had unexpected allies like the Brennans and Hobsons, and even careful respect from some who'd initially opposed them. Most importantly, she had chosen love over hate, hope over fear, courage over comfort. Tom would be proud, she thought, and somewhere beyond the sunset. Perhaps he was ready for tomorrow, Joseph asked, following her gaze to the mountains. Ready for all the tomorrows, Sarah replied. Whatever they bring. The Sierra Nevada mountains rose before them like white-capped giants, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. 2 months had passed since Joseph joined the wagon train, and his prediction about early winter had proved painfully accurate. Snow already dusted the lower passes, and the sky held that heavy gray that promised more. We should reach Truckee Pass in 3 days, Joseph told the gathered families. If we push hard, if the weather holds. And if it doesn't, Patterson demanded. He'd grown thinner on the trail, his hatred burning away his body as surely as the cold. Then we find shelter and wait. Joseph's calm never wavered, though Sarah saw the concern in his eyes. Better to arrive late than not at all. They pushed on, the wagons creaking through deepening snow. Sarah walked beside their wagon, Samuel strapped to her back in the cradleboard, now decorated with Martha Hobson's careful beadwork. The girl had become Joseph's eager student, learning not just crafts, but words in Shoshone, much to her grandmother's amusement and Patterson's fury. On the second night, the storm hit with a violence that took even Joseph by surprise. Wind screamed through the camp, driving snow horizontal, tearing at canvas wagon covers and threatening to scatter their livestock. Circle tighter, Hatfield bellowed over the gale. Livestock in the center. As families struggled to secure their possessions, Sarah noticed the Pattersons' wagon listing dangerously. Their oldest boy, Matthew, was trying desperately to hold down the canvas while his father fought with the spooked ox. Without thinking, Sarah thrust Samuel into Kate Brennan's arms and ran to help. Together, she and Matthew managed to secure one corner, then another. Joseph appeared through the swirling snow, adding his strength to theirs. Get your family to the Hobson wagon, he shouted at Patterson. This one won't last the night. For once, Patterson didn't argue. As they transferred the family's essential supplies, his wife touched Sarah's arm. Thank you, Mrs., Patterson whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. I know Hiram's been awful to you, but thank you. The storm raged for 2 days. Families huddled together, sharing warmth and what food could be eaten cold. Joseph's knowledge proved invaluable. He'd insisted they gather extra firewood before the storm, had shown them how to bank the wagons for maximum shelter. On the worst night, when the wind threatened to tear wagons apart, Joseph taught them an old Shoshone practice, heating rocks in the fire and wrapping them in blankets for warmth. Simple, effective, life-saving. Even Patterson accepted a heated stone for his shivering children, though he wouldn't meet Joseph's eyes. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to a transformed landscape. Drifts reached halfway up wagon wheels. The pass they'd planned to use was clearly impassable. There's another way, Joseph said, studying the mountains with narrowed eyes. Harder, but possible. An old Washoe trail, single file only. And we'd have to abandon some wagons, pack the essentials on mules and oxen. Abandon the wagons, several voices protested at once. Or abandon your lives. Joseph said bluntly, choose. It took a day to reorganize, deciding what was truly essential. Sarah watched families agonize over heirlooms, furniture, treasures carried from former homes. In the end, survival won. Wagons were broken down for firewood and shelter materials. Everything that couldn't help them live was left behind. The trail Joseph led them on was barely visible, a thread winding along cliff faces and through forests so thick with snow-laden pines that they moved in perpetual twilight, Single file. They picked their way forward, Joseph breaking trail, Hatfield bringing up the rear. On the third day of this torturous passage, disaster struck. A section of trail gave way under the Hobson's mule. The animal's scream was cut short as it plummeted into the ravine, taking with it most of their food supplies. "Mrs." Hobson stared at the broken trail in despair. Without those supplies, she and Martha would never make it to California. "We share," Sarah said immediately. "Everyone gives a little. No one starves." "But we share," Kate Brennan echoed firmly. Others nodded agreement. That night, as families redistributed their precious supplies, something shifted in the group's dynamics. They were no longer separate families trying to reach California. They were a community, bound by shared struggle and mutual survival. Even Patterson contributed his share, though he handed it to Sarah rather than Joseph. Progress, she thought wryly. The next challenge came at a frozen river crossing. The ice looked solid, but Joseph was wary. One at a time, he instructed, "Test each step. If you hear cracking, drop flat, distribute your weight." They were halfway across when young Tom Brennan went through. The boy's terrified scream galvanized everyone. But it was Joseph who reacted first, sliding on his belly across the treacherous ice. "Rope!" he shouted, and hands scrambled to obey. Sarah watched heart in throat as Joseph inched toward the hole where Tom had disappeared, just as the boy's strength gave out. Joseph's hand shot into the water, grabbing him by the collar. The rescue seemed to take forever, Joseph pulling the boy up, others carefully hauling them both to safety. Tom was blue with cold but alive, and his parents fell to their knees in gratitude. "He needs warmth, now," Joseph ordered, already stripping off his own coat to wrap around the boy. Dr. Pemberton and Joseph worked together, using every technique they knew to warm the child. Heated stones, skin-to-skin contact, warm tea forced between chattering teeth. The whole camp held its breath until Tom's color returned and his shivering subsided to normal levels. That night, Michael Brennan sought out Joseph. "I owe you my son's life. I won't forget." "No debt," Joseph said simply. "We are traveling together. Your son is all our sons." Sarah saw tears in the tough Irishman's eyes as he gripped Joseph's hand. They were so close now. "One more pass," Joseph said, and they'd begin the descent into the Sacramento Valley. But food was running dangerously low, and everyone was weakened by the journey. It was then that Patterson's hatred finally boiled over. Sarah woke before dawn to find him standing over her and Joseph's sleeping area, rifle in hand. "Get up, savage!" he hissed. Joseph woke instantly but moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. Sarah started to rise, but Joseph's slight gesture kept her still. "What is this about, Patterson? You've bewitched them all, made them forget what you are. But I remember. I know your kind." "Hiram, no, Mrs." Patterson appeared, grabbing her husband's arm. "He saved our lives in the storm. He saved the Brennan boy. Our own Matthew might have died without his help." "Lies, trickery." Patterson shook her off, but the commotion had woken others. People emerged from their shelters, forming a circle. "Put the gun down, Patterson," Hatfield commanded. "You gonna shoot him in cold blood?" Michael Brennan stepped forward. "The man who saved my son, who's guided us through these mountains when we'd all be frozen corpses without him." "He's turned you all into Indian lovers." Patterson's voice cracked with strain. "Can't you see him in her? It's unnatural against God." "What's against God, Mrs.?" Hobson said clearly. "Is hatred. What's against God is threatening murder." Sarah found her voice. "You want to shoot him? Hiram, then shoot me too, because I stand with him. We all do." One by one, people moved. The Brennans flanked Joseph. Dr. Pemberton stood beside Sarah. The Hobsons, the Wheelers who joined at Fort Bridger. Even families who'd been neutral, they formed a protective wall. Patterson looked around wildly. Finding no support, not even from those who'd shared his prejudice. Faced with Joseph's actual deeds versus Patterson's hatred, they'd chosen. "You're all damned," he whispered, lowering the rifle. "Damned." "Maybe," Sarah said quietly. "But we're alive, and we're together. That's more than your hatred ever gave you." Patterson stumbled away, his wife trailing behind with apologies in her eyes. The crisis passed, but something fundamental had changed. The wagon train had chosen not just to tolerate Joseph, but to claim him as one of their own. The final push to California was almost anticlimactic. They descended from the mountains into a valley golden with winter sun. Fields stretched before them, and in the distance, the smoke of settlements promised civilization, hot food, real beds. But first, they camped one last night together. Someone produced a hidden fiddle, saved through all the hardships. Music rose into the star-filled sky, and people danced, carefully on still-healing frostbitten feet, but with joy. Sarah watched Joseph teaching Samuel and the other children a simple Shoshone dance. Martha Hobson laughed as she tried to follow the steps, her grandmother clapping along. Even some of Patterson's children had snuck over to join, their father nowhere to be seen. "We made it," Kate Brennan said, coming to stand beside Sarah. "All of us, thanks to him and to you." "We made it together," Sarah corrected. "That's the only reason any of us survived." The next morning, as they prepared for the final march to Sacramento, Joseph stood before the assembled group. Tom's compass caught the morning light in his hand. "This guided me to Sarah when she needed help," he said. "Then it guided me back when she needed me again. But the real compass was here." He touched his chest. "The knowledge that we are all relations, all connected. You have taught me that this is possible even between peoples who call each other enemy." "You're family now," Hatfield said gruffly. "Any of us would be proud to call you brother." A chorus of agreement rose, and Sarah saw Joseph's composure finally crack. He who had faced down storms and soldiers and starvation with steady calm now blinked rapidly, overcome by acceptance. That evening, they reached Sacramento. The town sprawled before them, busy and booming with gold rush energy. Some families would stop here, others continue to San Francisco. They would scatter to new lives, but they would never forget what they'd shared. At a simple ceremony by a sympathetic judge who'd seen stranger unions in California, Sarah Morrison became Sarah Crowfeather, with the entire wagon train as witnesses. Samuel gurgled happily in Martha Hobson's arms as his new parents exchanged vows that transcended law or custom. "From winter to spring," Joseph murmured, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Always spring now," Sarah whispered back. As they signed the marriage certificate, Patterson appeared one last time, haggard, diminished. He looked at the celebrating crowd with hollow eyes. "I was wrong," he said simply, then walked away into the California sunset, carrying his burden of hate like chains he'd forged himself. 6 months later. Sarah stood in the doorway of their small house on the outskirts of San Francisco, watching Joseph teach Samuel to ride the painted pony they'd bought from a Mexican rancher. Her hand rested on her growing belly, where new life quickened, a child who would know both worlds and be diminished by neither. A letter from her aunt had arrived that morning, full of scandalized horror and threats of disinheritance. Sarah had fed it to the fire with a smile. They didn't need her aunt's money. Joseph's skills as a guide were in high demand, and Sarah had begun teaching at a small school that didn't care about her unusual family. "Mama, look," Samuel called in his mixture of English and Shoshone, as Joseph helped him guide the patient pony in circles. "I see you, brave warrior," Sarah called back, her heart so full it might burst. The neighbors still whispered sometimes. There were still those who crossed the street rather than passed them, but there were also friends. The Brennans had settled nearby, and Martha Hobson visited whenever her grandmother brought her to the city for supplies. Doctor Pemberton had set up practice and regularly consulted with Joseph on medicines. They were building something new in this gold-rushed land where fortunes changed overnight and rigid Eastern rules bent under Western necessity. A family born of tragedy but raised in hope. A love that had transformed curse to blessing, winter to spring. As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah felt Tom's presence one last time, a warm breeze, a sense of peace, a blessing on all that had grown from the ashes of loss. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, to memory, to the strange turnings of fate that had brought her here. Joseph looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile held all their journey, from that cave in Wyoming to this California garden, from hatred to love, from two broken people to a family whole and growing. Sarah smiled back, one hand on Samuel's future sibling, the other reaching out to her husband and son. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. They had traveled through winter and found their spring, and nothing, not prejudice, not hardship, not the whispers of a scandalized world could take that from them. In the distance, a Shoshone lullaby mixed with an Irish fiddle tune drifted from the Brennan house. Two cultures, two musics, creating something new and beautiful in the California evening. Just like them, just like the America Tom had believed in, now being built one family, one choice, one act of love at a time. The story of the widow who cursed savages but found salvation in a warrior's arms had become something larger, a testament to the power of love over hate, of courage over convention, of the families we choose over the prejudices we inherit. And in a small house on a San Francisco hillside, that love continued to grow, strong as mountain pine, enduring as the sunrise, proof that even in the harshest winter, spring always comes to those brave enough to seek it. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know your thoughts on Sarah and Joseph's journey. What touched your heart? What surprised you? We're excited to connect with listeners from around the world.